Good morning. We are live. I'm Jessica Dumas. Thank you very much for joining me and my guest on Friday interviews at Insights Inc. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is to create an opportunity to help our Indigenous professionals shine in an even brighter light, because that's what I love to do. And I think the more that we encourage others to shine, the more people around us really allow themselves to shine, and we really need to be doing more of that. So I'm a professional coach and a facilitator. I have an online life coaching program called My Prime Image Life Coaching. And I called it that because I really believe that we have a prime image. We have an inner image of who we want to be. And it's a journey to sometimes getting there and to finding that. So I also have a one-day workshop called Indigenous Insight Seminars. And this has been my response to a need for people wanting to know more about how do we engage in truth and reconciliation? What do we do? And so I created a workshop to try to help Canadians better understand things that they're hearing in the media, and to really, if you want to have an opinion, you need to have some education. And so creating that base and that foundation of understanding what some of Canada's foundational acts and policies have actually been with Indigenous people. So as a result of doing that training, in addition to other workshops that I do, and you can find out more at jessicadumas.com by hitting workshops. But as a result of doing this work, I've had people say to me, well, I don't really know any Indigenous people, and how do I connect with Indigenous people? So naturally, as a creator and a facilitator, I wanted to do something to make that happen. And so that's where these interviews have come from. So I really believe that every day is an opportunity to encourage our youth and to demonstrate to them some of the amazing things that some of our leaders have done for us in many different areas, such as business and entertainment and culture, and just recreating this really positive lifestyle. I really believe that Indigenous youth are much more successful when they can see themselves reflected in the greater community and the greater economy. And I think that in a time where our population, the Indigenous population, is the fastest growing in Canada, that we need to really make that more evident. But you are seeing evidence of that here and there. I know that for sure, because I'm lucky enough to be a part of it. So I always get to talk about all the cool and amazing people that I get to meet. But one of the things that I've really allowed myself to do is to be different. And sometimes what that means to me is just calling up someone that I don't know to say, hey, I want to get to know you because I like what you're doing. And so that's what I've done with this gentleman who I'm going to ask to join me. We actually got to meet once. That was we just bumped into each other. But the first time that I heard about Mr. Frank Busch, there he is. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very good.
Good, thanks. So the first time that I think we connected on Facebook, just because we kind of saw, in the community, people doing things. And then I was in a meeting in Winnipeg, and we had a guest. Her name was Renee Price. And she said, hey, I'm so happy to meet you. I've heard all about you. And I'm like, oh, that's nice. Who did you hear about me from? And she said, Frank Busch. And I was like, wow, I've never met Frank Busch. So that was so compliment.
Oh, yeah. Well, I really believe in helping to promote the work that we are doing as Indigenous people. So when I do see someone doing something, especially what you do, because it's something I always thought about doing and wanted to do, and thought there needs to be more of this. There needs to be more people out there willing to help each other. We call that lateral kindness. It's the only cure for the lateral violence that has come out of the residential school system. So, whenever anybody asks, like, hey, do you know anybody? Sometimes I talk about people I don't really know, just because I know what they're doing, from their social media activity. And hey, the Moccasin Telegraph is alive and well, and it runs a lot faster on Facebook. So so I have been following your career fairly closely, and really like the work you're doing. And anybody who's out there to help our people is definitely someone I want as an ally.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. So Frank, right now you're in BC. But
I'm on West Bank First Nation.
Sorry?
Yeah, I'm in West Bank First Nation in BC. It's Okanagan territory, never surrendered by treaty or conquest. So it's a sovereign territory. Very successful, very wealthy First Nation. The first time I came here, I didn't even know I was on a reserve. I was looking for gravel roads and three-legged dogs, and instead I got Walmart and Starbucks. So that's the reserve I live on.
Right.
I'm originally from the Nisichawayasihk Cree Nation in Northern Manitoba. I left the North when I was 10 years old, and lived in Winnipeg most of my life up until about 5 years ago when I moved here.
Fabulous. That's so exciting. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation about what some of the differences that you see in Manitoba and in the community that you're working in now, and why you think that is. But let's not get there just yet. I want to talk a little bit more about what you do. So right now you're the information and marketing director.
Yeah.
Did I get the whole title right?
Yeah, close enough. Yeah. So I don't spend a lot of time on titles, but I guess for lack of a better word, I guess I'd say I'm the either communications officer or salesman for the organization. We're a nonprofit, so it's very different setup than other business and stuff that you might see. So my job is really to create awareness of our services in the First Nations Finance Authority to First Nations governments. So I do a lot of traveling. I talk a lot with senior management of First Nations, with chief and council, occasionally with membership, and basically anybody else who's out there trying to improve the quality of life in First Nations in Canada. So to date, and even just in the last 5 years, I've traveled to over 200 First Nations communities in Canada.
Oh my goodness. Wow. What an opportunity. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So what would you say, tell us a little bit about your career to how you got to where you are right now. So you grew up in Manitoba, in Northern Manitoba until you were 10 years old. What was your childhood like with regards to culture?
It was pretty scary, I guess you might say. We were, I guess what you might describe as a little bit more middle class than most people. When we first moved to Lynn Lake, Manitoba, most of the First Nations people were living in a shanty town just outside of town limits because First Nations people were really discouraged, even by municipal bylaw, to live in the town. So my dad was at the time a non-status Indian because his First Nation in Saskatchewan had not signed treaty. And back in those days, if you didn't have status, you were just considered non-native. So we were able to live in town. My mother, however, full status and everything, she lost her status prior to Bill C-31. So growing up town, my older brother and sister, their first language is Cree. But as soon as they got registered to the school in Lynn Lake, the principal tried to send them to residential school. So after that, basically the only reason myself and my older brother and sister didn't go to residential school is because the Indian agent in Nelson House refused to pay our train fare. So because we weren't on the ban list at the time. So that kind of administrative glitch saved me from going to the Guy Hill Indian Residential School, which I'm kind of grateful for. But on the other hand, people were forbidden to speak our language in our home. So I actually never learned my language. I'm only kind of relearning it now with the help of some teachers I have. Dr. Neil McLeod is probably one of the best when he does some Cree words for the day. And I've got a community member in Nelson House as well who posts to Facebook Cree words to practice in our dialect. We speak the TH dialect. But it was very difficult. I didn't realize I was Native until other kids told me, and that was the reality of it. I didn't think it was very strange, to go to somebody's home who didn't have plumbing. We would visit relatives in South Indian Lake and Nelson House fairly regularly. And it didn't seem like a big deal, it was just like, oh, okay, that's their setup. It's fine, right? But then if friends, white friends found out that was the situation, they'd kind of laugh about it. And I always found that very strange that anybody would want to laugh that somebody else's situation was more difficult than somebody else's. So those are the conditions I grew up in. When we moved to Winnipeg when I was 10 years old, then I really knew that I was Native because we were the only Native family in our neighborhood. And so when I went to school, I was always the only Native person in the class. And I was only there for about 2 years, just trying to figure out the city a little bit when the Meech Lake Accord and the Oka crisis happened. So that's kind of where I really feel my mettle was forged, was in the fires of Oka. because I was very much singled out in school, in junior high, and even on to high school because of my native ancestry. And I've always been, even in those days in the city, kind of loud and proud. I always wore a lot of beadwork. I always wore a lot of hides and stuff, things my mother had made, my aunties had made for me, and that. And I definitely stood out, quite a bit. And I run into old classmates from Winnipeg fairly often, and they just say, "Wow, you haven't changed. You're still wearing the uniform," kind of thing, right? So I make it pretty clear, who I am and whose side I'm on, I guess, for lack of a better description. And that's kind of really where it came from. My dad was quite a trailblazer. He was in the RCMP for 37 years, one of the First Nations officers through the Special Constables program. And my mother was an activist. She was actually president of the Aboriginal Women in Manitoba for a number of years and helped to co-found the National Aboriginal Diabetes Association. So I was raised by a cop and an activist, and that was kind of an interesting experience,
Sure.
People always joke that my dad would be arresting my mom for civil disobedience or something, eh? So, and there were a couple situations where that almost happened, So I think I understand both sides of any argument fairly well, that I'm able to respect other people's opinions and understand that people come to their opinions based on their life experience. And the only way to change someone's mind is to give them a new life experience. So I really try to role model, for First Nations people, especially in the non-Native community, to show them that, look, we are human beings. We are the same as you. We want the same things. We want improved quality of life. We want to be able to practice our culture and our spirituality just like any other culture in Canada. Everybody gets to do their thing, and we want that. We don't want to be discouraged from it. And in a lot of ways, First Nations people are still discouraged from practicing our culture and our spirituality and from being proud of who we are, to be able to say, like, hey, I'm First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and I'm happy to be that. It's okay for me to be that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think what's really outstanding in your story is that residential school was in your lifetime, right? So many people think that, it was so long ago, but here you were as a child where that could have been part of your childhood, and you're in our generation. People don't realize.
I graduated high school in 1996, which was the same year that the last residential school in Canada closed. And I actually have a cousin who was at Lebret Whitecalf the year it closed. So we're about the same age. So we had very different life experiences. I went to public school in Winnipeg, and she went to residential school, and we are the same age. So it is definitely something that's prevalent in our lifetime. Also, I very much grew up in the shadow of residential schools. I mean, there was a lot of abuse that was prevalent in our community. Myself and my cousins have all suffered some level of mental, psychological, physical, or sexual abuse, and it's something that we need to work towards to break the cycle. And it's really just the little things. One thing that happened, because of our residential school history, we never hugged. We never hugged each other growing up. My brothers and sisters, my mom and dad. I think one of the first time I remember being hugged by my parents was when I left home at 18. So one of the things my sister and I started doing is we would, when we see each other, we hug. And, at first it was really awkward. I could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and I felt like all clenchy and, and all this. But our children would see us hug. And now when our children see each other, they hug like it's reflexive. There's no holdback. So we kind of had to force ourselves to do that. And I encourage other people who are dealing with the residential school legacy to do that, to force yourself at least to model a role model for your children.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that as well. And I think that I've tried to do the same for myself and my family, right? With my children, really making that extra effort. And it's such a conscious decision, and it shouldn't have to be, but that's definitely the legacy. Right. Yes. And I lost my brother in 2005. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but he was killed by the police in the north end of Winnipeg. And so that was something that was really of course, life-changing for me, but was really when I started to learn more about my history and my culture and who I was. But it was shortly before that we lost him that he was going through a rough time. And I remember just feeling this urge to just hug him and hold him. And that wasn't something that was normal for us. But I just thought, you know what? I'm just going to do this. And of course, now I just think, wow, thank goodness that I took that step to do that, because yeah, breaking cycles is really something that people in our generation, you're seeing some of, but we're still seeing some of the challenges as well.
Yeah, and we have to really overcome that. I think lateral violence is really the cancer in our community. It just causes so many problems, and we don't realize that it is a residential school legacy. One of the things that the staff at residential schools, the nuns, the priests would encourage is for our people to kind of call each other down. So what happens is whenever you seem to tell First Nations people, family members, that you're thinking about doing something, it's almost reflects like a reflex that they want to kind of poo-poo your idea or tell you it'll never work or tell you you're not capable of doing it. And it's because we were told that. I remember hearing a story that my grandmother once said that she wanted to be a nurse, and the nuns at Sturgeon Landing were just relentless against her. Even a 7, 8-year-old girl, just laughing at the idea that a First Nations woman could ever be a nurse. And I know quite a few First Nations nurses now, and even some doctors, and I'm really proud of that. But in our grandparents' time, just the very idea of it was just not possible. It was not something anyone would consider, and that's a difficult circumstance to overcome. We face those challenges externally. We need to eliminate them internally. We got to really stop doing that. If somebody has an idea, if you don't have anything encouraging to say, then just keep your mouth quiet, or better yet, force yourself to say something positive. Force yourself to help in some way. Every time I hear a First Nations person is trying to do something, I ask them what I can do to help. Can I help promote their business? Can I help provide something for them, how I can encourage them, what I can do for them. I really feel like I need to do that because other people did it for me. There was people in my life who believed in me at a time when I didn't believe in myself. And, some of those key people are my elders, Margaret and Jules LaValle, my former jiu-jitsu sensei, Sensei Steve Prince from Long Plain First Nation, and one of my other mentors who is now Chief Christian Sinclair from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. So all these people really helped me. There's another guy too. I keep his picture on my wall over here. I don't know if you can see it very well, but the first MLA of Manitoba, Mr. Elijah Harper. And I actually purchased that picture at very great expense from David Neal, who's a famous jeweler and carver in the Salish territory. It's one of the original 4 of the photo appeared in the National Post in 1994. So just the impact that the Meech Lake Accord had on me at 12 years old, I keep that very nearby so that I'm always reminded that, the things I'm doing are to carry forward for those who came before me and prepared the way and made things easier. I really want to be able to make this journey easier for my children and my nieces and nephews and those who are coming after me. And that's really, I think, all we need to do as First Nations people is to help prepare the way for the next 7 generations as part of our medicine wheel teachings. And I try to live that every day. I always try to open doors for people as well as I can. Try to create opportunities in that and do what I can for as many others as I'm able to do.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Lateral kindness. I'm so happy to hear that today, because that's definitely a message that we need to hear more about, for sure.
Yeah, no, I try to do it daily. So I say, I try to do a daily act of lateral kindness. Sometimes if I'm really busy, I just share somebody's website, just if it's an artist or a business person or something like that, I'll just share their website, or I'll try to comment on social media like, hey, you're doing a great job, keep it up. Because sometimes, you don't know what people's struggles are. Sometimes they can get in situations where they're just about to give up until they hear somebody else say like, hey, you're doing great work.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for people like me and like you and all the other people that we have in our lives, do you feel that you've felt a calling that, there's something that that you need to do and that's been part of your drive?
Yeah, I really believe that. I started doing a lot of reading and hearing from First Nation speakers about what the challenge is, and something that really drives me on a daily basis is I read a book called Dances with Dependency by Calvin Helene, and in the book he talks about the struggle for First Nations people to improve quality of life, but he also talks about the demographic tsunami that's coming. So we are in the midst of a really big baby boom in the First Nations community. Back in 1920, there was only about 130,000 First Nations people left in Canada. Today, there's about that many in Manitoba alone. We are about 1.4 million Aboriginal or Indigenous people in Canada. So we already in the last 90 years or almost 100 years have our population has grown tenfold. Now, population growth is exponential. I was talking to one of the chiefs in Manitoba, and they were just having their graduation. And I asked him, well, how many graduates did you have this year? And he said, oh, we had 6. And I was like, oh, hey, that's pretty good, but I thought it was a pretty big community. He said, yeah, about half of our kids drop out. There's about a 50% dropout rate. I said, okay, so you should have had 12. And he goes, yes, but I had 200 registrations for kindergarten this year. So
Wow.
from 12 possible grade 12 graduates to 200 in kindergarten, that is what's coming. And with all the funding cuts and funding caps that are happening in our community, it is really incumbent on us, those of us who are able, business leaders and entrepreneurs, to try to provide as much opportunity for the demographic tsunami when it comes to us. And we're really just in the middle of it. Already more than half of our population is under the age of 25. At 38 years old, I'm already an elder. That shouldn't be, but it's the reality.
Oh my goodness, that's an incredible statistic. Six.
Yeah, no, I just read so much stuff. Yeah, but that's what I see on a daily basis. So,
Yeah.
and that's what people ask me that, like, oh, what have you learned going over 200 First Nations, eh? And the thing I learned is there's a lot of kids coming up, and I don't want people in situations where they grow up on the reserve just so they can leave it. Success in our community shouldn't be that you left the reserve. It should be that you were able to create opportunities for yourself and others. I always say we have enough social workers. We're plenty of social workers. We're a social worker to death. What we need are business leaders and entrepreneurs. We need CPAs, MBAs, CFAs. The work that the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association is doing is really great. They're helping to prepare people for roles in administration and finance because those are the people that are going to have to really step up, and they're already taxed to the limit as it is right now today. I've never met a band manager who wasn't just completely on the brink of snapping. And to me, it's really the key role in any First Nations community, and those are the people I try to help. So I'm currently engaged with about 120 band managers across Canada, and I really try to do everything I can in my power to help make their jobs and their lives easier, and in whatever way I can.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous. So what got you started in your career, in this stream of career? So you graduated high school from Winnipeg, and then
no, I graduated in Regina. My dad had been transferred to the RCMP depot in Regina, so I spent 2 years. My grade 11 and 12 was in Regina, and then I came back to Winnipeg to attend University of Manitoba, where I studied Native Studies. I got pretty involved, which I try not to recommend to people. But I was the National Native Studies representative, and I was the president of the Aboriginal Student Association. My GPA took a bit of a dive in that year when I was doing those two things. So I was just a little bit too involved in volunteering and not enough focus on my studies. But I was able to, try to reset and bring everything back up in my 4th year. But then what I found is that everybody seemed to have gone and earned an arts degree, and there weren't a lot of jobs out there. So one of the first jobs that I found was as the finance assistant for the Manitoba Aboriginal Sport and Recreation Council. So I remember that because I was pretty, I guess, desperate, to find something good or find something in the First Nations. I'm actually proud to say that I've never been unemployed for one day in my adult working life. So 20 years, I have been fully employed. I've never taken breaks between jobs. And many times I've worked two jobs, to make sure I'm meeting my goals and getting to where I want to get to. But that particular job, I probably, fudged a little bit. The way the person asked the questions, the former executive director, when he interviewed me, he said, could you do payroll? And I said, yes, I could. He said, could you do financial statements? I said, yes, I could. Could you do accounts receivable and accounts payable? Yes, I could. He goes, when can you start? And I said, oh, I could start whenever you need me. And he goes, okay, well, start. Can you start tomorrow? And I said, sure. So I'd never done any of those things. I'd never done payroll, AR, accounts receivable, nothing like that. But I drove to the bookstore immediately and I bought a copy of Accounting for Dummies. And I read it cover to cover that night and started my new job the next morning. So so I learned how to do those things, and then I kind of just fell down the stairs from there. Like one job led to another, and I took courses through Athabasca in accounting, and just kind of tried to supplement my skills and learn from others. And somehow I just kind of climbed the ladder up to where I am today. As the managing director of a national First Nations finance authority. So. Kind of weird way to get started, but it is how it is, and I'm continually taking courses.
Yeah, it's such a great way to get started, right? One of the motivational speakers about money that I listen to, her name is Laura Langmeyer, and she says, "Say yes now and figure out how." And as soon as I heard that, I was like, I know that energy, right? I can feel that. And there were times that I've accepted, on a contract basis, that, can you do this job? And I'm like, yeah. And I knew it sounded interesting. For example, one of them, I can't remember what it was described at, but it was really evaluating and editing an entire website. And I was like, I've never done that, but I'm going to figure out how, right? And that really, learning those skills, not that I would recommend to everybody jumping into something that you don't know, but accessing an opportunity and then continuous learning, right? And obviously you're demonstrating that.
Yes, yeah, no, I've earned a number of certificates since then. So I've did the Canadian Securities course, and I've got certified for derivatives as well. We seem to have a lot of people with accounting knowledge in First Nations communities, figuring out where the money went. We don't have a lot of people in finance, people who figure out where the money's coming from or how to manage the money when you get there. So I've been doing a lot of focus on learning about investment, stocks, bonds, mutual funds. I've incorporated investing into my personal life to increase my net worth and build wealth for my children and future generations and family and all that. And I try to teach our First Nations people how to do that. There are some First Nations who are coming into large settlement agreements to the tune of $100 or $200 million. And they don't always know what to do with that. So I try to help advise on, how to set up a trust, how to not get taken advantage of in fees. And I actually just attended a course with AFOA Canada at Harvard University. We did a week-long executive education. There were 66 of us, 40 from Canada and 26 from the United States. And it was all on leading people and investing to build sustainable communities. So we did a number of topics, investment, negotiation, leadership, and talked to some really key people. They had one of the professors who taught the course was actually one of the co-founders of the Harvard Project. So that was a really life-changing experience, and I hope to do more things like that and to kind of just continue the learning process. So I feel like the more I learn, the more I'm able to apply myself to, the more help I can be to others and to the community.
Yeah, fantastic. This is such a fascinating conversation, or, our first time really having a conversation, because I met you last year in 2016, I guess, in the fall, when Fisher River Cree Nation was opening up their building center. It was Castle Building Center in Fisher River.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is our first time.
That's actually a project our organization financed. So we actually provided the financing for Fisher River to do that. They went through a major process to get certified by our sister organization, the First Nations Financial Management Board. As soon as they had that certificate, it allowed them to be able to open, to access the kind of financing that municipal, provincial, and federal governments access. First Nations are often treated as either a business or an individual when they go to the banks, and that's not how governments borrow. Governments don't borrow monies at 5-year terms at prime plus interest rates. They actually issue bonds. So our organization issues bonds on the financial markets. So we actually take First Nation, like I always tell the chiefs, I'm going to take you to Wall Street, I'm going to take you to Bay Street and find you the best money we can find you. And it's, working around the banks, working around the Indian affairs, and going to where money actually comes from, which is the capital markets. Mm-hmm. So you have to be fairly comfortable in two worlds. Sometimes I have to go from to the res to Wall Street and be comfortable doing that, right? So, but it's really how things are going to change in a major way. We've actually loaned just under 400 million to First Nations over the last about 4 or 5 years. Wow. So I go around doing projects to the tune of $100 million a year every year, and I'm actually hoping to increase that pace.
That's fantastic. Do you find that you're having to really educate the community even about the mentality that this is really an opportunity?
Yeah,
they're not there yet, and you sort of need to pull them, or what is that looking like?
Yeah, sometimes I usually get the idea that it's too good to be true. So I've actually been almost thrown out of a couple band offices and council chambers because they thought I was, making this all up because it just seemed too strange. Yeah. But then I usually ask, the council, I'll say, well, how do you think the municipality next door does it? Yeah. I said, if they want to pave a road, do you think they go to Indian Affairs? Do you think they, apply for a grant of the government? Like, no, they borrow against their revenues. So every government has monies coming in the door. The band office is definitely no exception. They just need to be able to leverage those funds in a way that allows them to do major projects, now that they can, benefit from for many years. When you build a water treatment plant, you're not expecting it to only last 1 year. You're expecting it to last 25 to 50 years. Right. So you shouldn't have to pay it off on an annual funding basis. You should be able to have it financed like a mortgage over a number of years, but First Nations haven't had that ability. There's been this mentality that, don't worry, Ottawa's going to take care of you. Well, having been to 200 plus First Nations in Canada, I can tell you that a large number of them still live in third world conditions. And that's something that needs to be fixed right away, and that's something we're helping to do. And by allowing and enabling the First Nations to do it themselves, it really changes the way First Nations people and governments think about themselves and how they operate. We opened the Chief Crowfoot School in Siksika, Alberta last September. It was a $25 million project. And that was pretty exciting because they lost their school due to mold from their 2013 flood. And there's quite a long waiting list for schools from Ottawa in the First Nations community. I've heard at one point in time it's possibly as long as 64 years if you needed a new school, because they're only able to build one school on a First Nation in Canada every year. And there's about 64 approved projects at last count. So that's nearly impossible. Siksika Nation didn't want to wait that long. So they said, okay, what money do we have? And how can we best use it to build our own school for our own children? And they did that, and I got to be there the day they cut the ribbon, and it was very exciting. Fisher River, same thing. One day I went there, they cut 4 ribbons on 4 separate projects. And I understand just a couple of days ago, they did it again. They broke ground on a number of new projects and that, and we're just really excited to be a part of their success story, and we're doing it in First Nations all around Manitoba, all over Canada. I think Manitoba is our fastest growing market. We put 65 million into Manitoba First Nations in the last 2 years, and I'm hoping to do that again this year.
Fantastic. I think there's a lot of things about the Indian Act that non-Indigenous people don't understand, right? Because they wonder, well, why don't you just do this, right? But they don't understand that involuntary and imposed dependency by the Indian Act and that's done to our communities.
Yeah, and one of the things too, especially around housing, it's very difficult for non-Native people to understand that you can't actually fully own property on a First Nation. So most of the housing, almost all the housing in many First Nations is actually band owned. So you're really little more than a renter. And it's funny because some people lived in their house 20 years and really believe they own it or think it's theirs, but they can't produce a title deed and they can't sell it. So that's creates a major difficulty for a lot of First Nations. I'd be perfectly willing to build on my First Nation, but the problem is because without proper legislation in order, a new council could get in and potentially kind of throw me out of my own house. So I don't know if anybody in my community would do that, but just the fact that it could legally happen creates an unacceptable level of risk for me to invest my own money into. So, and I think a lot of First Nations people feel that way. They don't put a lot of money into housing because they're renting. They're not the landlord. And the First Nations themselves, through the funding agreements, are really just taxed to the limit, only able to sustain the housing stock that they have, and really having a difficult time to increase that. And going back to the demographic tsunami, you got 200 kids in the kindergarten class. Well, in 18 years, they're all going to need homes. And most First Nations, if I told them like, "Hey, you're going to have to build 200 homes this year," they would absolutely just lose their minds. I mean, the idea of getting 10 houses on a large First Nation in a year is very impressive. We actually have a member, Peter Valentine Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, and they borrowed from us and were able to build 52 homes in a single year. That was a life-changing experience for their communities.
Yeah.
And I see that as if they were waiting on a housing list, they'd be on that list forever. And I think that's why now more than half of all First Nations people have left the reserve. One of the biggest reasons is just lack of adequate housing.
Mm-hmm. Such interesting dynamics, and I think one that many will never understand, not living on a reserve. So one of the questions that I get asked all the time, and because you've visited and been a part of development in so many different communities, what is the difference between Manitoba's success in the First Nations and BC's success in the First Nations?
Well, BC has a lot of very wealthy communities. I'd have to say that Manitoba has zero wealthy communities. Manitoba in the First Nations map contains some of the most impoverished First Nations in the country, including my home community of Opiponapewin, or formerly South Indian Lake. Absolutely one of the poorest communities in Canada, not just Manitoba. And a lot of it has to do with flooding damage that was caused by Manitoba Hydro in 1974 with the Nelson River diversion, put our whole community under many feet of water. But more importantly, it destroyed our fisheries. I come from a fishing village. I could have led a simple life as a fisherman and made a very good living. At one point in time before the flood, we were pulling 1 million pounds of whitefish out of the lakes and that. And now, because of contamination, because of mercury, because of soil erosion, we're not able to do that. I remember my aunt showed pictures from before the flood. The water of our lake was like a navy blue color. And today it's like lime green from all the clay and silt and sediments that get into the water. There has been the Northern Flood Agreement that was supposed to compensate for that. But you really can't compensate for putting 80% of a community out of work. I mean, that's kind of damage can be mainly irreversible. And we have stories like that all over Manitoba where industry and government has basically just run roughshod over the First Nations. In BC, they weren't able to do that because the BC bans for a lot of sections of BC never signed treaty. So part of what happened with the Chilcotin decision was that the Supreme Court kind of looked at it and said, hey, you guys never actually acquired the land. So these lands are not British Columbia. They are not Canada. You don't get to set the rules. You never made a deal. So now they're scrambling to do this modern day treaty process in BC. But I'm telling the BC bands, like, well, if you want to get into treaty, maybe you should come visit my home community that signed Treaty 5 in 1875 and see what conditions we live in. Because if that's how you picture your community in 100 years, I think you can do much better. So that's really a really big difference. The BC First Nations have really, because they were left out of treaty, they were really forced to try to stand on their own 2 feet. So you don't have a lot of communities in British Columbia where they have large-scale welfare dependency. And some of the communities I visited in Northern Manitoba and Northwest Ontario, there are people who are fourth generation welfare dependent. And then that's very hard to break out of that cycle of poverty and to tell children whose parents and grandparents died on social assistance that they can do something else. It's crazy because people think that they would not do anything. Reserve, everybody is working. Like, everybody is working very hard. They're always helping family members. They're just not always doing paid labor. So, I mean, you are expected in the reserve to chop wood for your relatives, and you're not expected to be paid. You get fed. That's usually about it, right? So, and when I go home, it's no different. I'm expected to clean fish and to pluck geese and ducks and stuff like that, and they just put you to work immediately. It's expected. It's just that we have a more of a traditional economy, and people aren't properly compensated. With artists and trappers, I always give them cash, and because I always know that whatever cash I give them, I'm going to get it back tenfold. You give a trapper $100, he'll probably give you $1,000 worth of meat over the course of the year. So, and I kind of rely on that all over communities, especially living here in BC. I have a hard time getting moose and caribou meat, and you get nostalgic. So so that's what I do. I try to help a lot of the traditional hunters and gatherers, in what ways I can. And then, next thing you know, I'm getting a call from the bus depot saying there's a cooler duct taped up with my name on it, right? So, and I get to the bus depot pretty quickly when I hear that's happening. So, but that's something we got to look at, and I explain this to industry too, because you got to keep in mind at the same time, I'm also talking to major companies who want to do business with First Nations. And a common trend I see is that they'll go to the First Nation, they'll do some community engagement process where they'll be outlining the plan for whatever resource development they want to do. And then some kind of weirdly dressed old man will stand up, say something in his language, and everybody leaves. And he doesn't know. He's like, was that the chief? Was that whoever? And he's like, no, that's some old trapper, right? And but they just carry so much weight in our communities, the traditional hunters and the trappers, because they're the ones who are most connected with the land. And a lot of First Nations or Aboriginal engagement processes leave these people out. They don't consider them important. They look right by them. They look at their shoddy clothes and their kind of melted rubber boots and that, and they just dismiss them as immediately, right? And it's just so wrong. And I always tell these people, because I'll talk to different companies or mining companies or whatever, I'll say, look, you don't go to southern Saskatchewan and ignore the farmers. And really, you got to see trappers and fishers as how you view farmers in southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta. You wouldn't go to somebody's farm and tell them, hey, we're gonna start drilling for oil, or we're gonna strip mine, or we're gonna open pit mine in your land, and don't worry, we'll give you some money. You don't do that. That's not what happens in our country. However, in a First Nation, that can be the process. So they need to be aware that there are traditional hunters and gatherers, and that if they want to do some kind of development, they have to include them, incorporate them, have minimal environmental impact, have a land remediation strategy, just a lot of other things, but to never discount anybody's voice. I mean, in our community, everybody's voice is important. Everybody's considered, and it's not. There's cultural differences that are very different. So I always tell companies, look, if you want to do business in First Nations territories, you better start hiring some First Nations people. That's really a key to that's the first step in engagement. Start training, employing, and set up scholarships and bursaries for First Nations people. To show that you're truly an ally in it for the long haul, not just coming to kind of extract resources and then disappear back into the cities. That's not what we're looking for.
Yeah, for sure. I want to ask you one other question because I want to be conscious of the time, but I also want to, two other questions. Here's my first one is, would you be interested in joining me again, in a couple of weeks to continue this conversation? Because I feel like there's so many valuable questions that I could ask that are going to be really in depth, and I don't want to keep you all day. Is that something you'd be interested in?
Oh yeah, no, I would love that for sure.
Okay, because I'm already thinking like, oh my goodness, there's so much good information that you're sharing that's so valuable. So thank you. But I did want to ask you before we end our call today is talk about mentorship for a little bit. So just talk about, are you currently mentoring? What does that look like to you? And how have you utilized mentorship in your life? Uh-oh.
That's something over the years had a lot of mentors.
Oh no. Are you there?
Yeah, here I am. Sorry, I don't know. It said that you left the room.
Yeah, we kind of I think that we're still good. I think we're
Okay,
still
all
good.
right.
Did you hear my
Yeah, I might need you to repeat it though.
Okay, so I wanted to hear a little bit about mentorship from you. So do you continue to mentorship? What does that look like for you? And what kind of mentorship have you utilized in your career?
I've been kind of blessed with a lot of good mentors over the years, and it took a while, but I got comfortable with asking others for help. And that's something that was a very good and life changing experience for me, was to be able to kind of seek out people who are out there doing it, ask them to tell their stories, and ask them, what things look like, how they did it. Also, in my job selection, when I decided I was going to change career paths or change jobs, I was really conscientious about knowing who the boss was, because I figured, I don't ever want to work for a boss. I'd like to work for a mentor. So actually, the president and CEO of the First Nations Finance Authority is Ernie Daniels from Salt River First Nation. He's a residential school survivor, and he's actually one of the very first, certified general accountants in the Northwest Territories. That was First Nations. So I learned a lot from him. He was actually also director of finance for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, and later president and CEO of the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association of Canada. So after I met him, I did a lot of research, and now that we have Google, it's great because you can find out everything about anybody, really. And I found out his career path, and I kind of said that in my job interview. I said, look, I'm not looking for a boss. I'm looking for a mentor, and just the fact that I knew so much about his career, I think, was impressive to them at the interview. And it's really what I wanted to do, is say, okay, who are the people that I want to be more like, and what can I do to learn from them? A lot of times it involves helping people. I've done a lot of work, especially, for my traditional and spiritual development. I've worked for a lot of elders, and a lot of that times that means picking rocks and chopping wood. Just for the opportunity to sit for an hour and hear about their lives or hear about the teachings and that. So I try to balance those things between career objectives and kind of personal development as well, and do that as much as possible. So, I used to do a lot of mentorship. I was involved with Gani Kanichik, Dr. Leslie Spillett, and they have a really good program in Winnipeg called Restoring the Sacred, where they match up, First Nations mentors with First Nations mentees. And it was a really wonderful program, and I got to mentor a youth from Northern Manitoba who was fairly new to the city, and just kind of show them the ropes. I mean, just being able to show people how buses work when they're new to the city is really a great thing to do. Also, telling them what colors not to wear when they go downtown is pretty important, because coming from a reserve, you don't know that information. So I've been doing, I used to do a lot of that. I now have 3 children. My oldest is 6 years old, and now I'm kind of a full-time mentor to the three of them. However, what I try to do is more partnership mentorage, I guess, where I try to meet someone who has skills and abilities that I want, and trade them. So I teach them or tell them about the things I know about in exchange for their knowledge. So I do that a lot with artists. I do have quite an attachment to the arts community. I'm also an author. I think we might have mentioned, my novel Gray Eyes and that. So I do consider myself a part-time artist, when I write fiction novels. But that seems to be a much funner way to do it, I guess, at my stage in life, at my age right now. So I'm kind of in the middle. So finding other people around my age, older or younger, who have skill sets that I want, or attributes that I admire. We have to stop being scared to tell people that. We have to be able to tell people, hey, I see what you're doing, and I think it's great, and I admire you as a person, and there's qualities that you have that I'd like to learn about and incorporate into my life to be a better person. I always tell people, the only person you need to be better than is the person you were yesterday. And the only person I really aspire to be is the person I want to be tomorrow. And that's, I think, something we have to look at and really incorporate into our lives is, what am I doing today that's going to make me a better person tomorrow? And spend a little bit of time. I always try to do at least 1 hour of kind of nonfiction reading or some kind of information gathering that helps me be more knowledgeable or helps me in my life. I'm really addicted to audiobooks. As First Nations people, yes, you do. As First Nations people, we drive a lot. I know we're always driving back to the res. I don't know, is that
Roads, yeah.
Now, when you do that, though, I mean, a lot of us will either just talk or we'll listen to music or something like that. I try not to listen to music when I drive, because sometimes you're just listening to whatever comes on the radio and you're kind of wasting your time. If I can get a good audiobook and put it in the CD player or play it off of my, device or something like that, I feel like I can use that driving time learning something. And so I've done a lot of audiobooks from like John Maxwell on leadership and other ones on finance and things that might help me in my career. But also sometimes you just need a little bit of motivation and inspiration. It's really easy for us to kind of get down on ourselves because of the challenges we face as Indigenous people. Because just when you know the history, you feel like there's this, freight train pushing against you in the wrong direction. So sometimes to be able to continue to feel like you can work against that, you have to do that. So I like to say I have a lot of mentors, many of whom I've never met. I think Tony Robbins and John Maxwell are definitely two of the top ones in my mind. I always buy all their books, all their audiobooks as often as I can, as soon as I hear a new one's coming out, just to keep myself motivated and to kind of keep going. But I really love my First Nations role models. I was really inspired actually by Justice Murray Sinclair at a young age. I used to kind of follow him around everywhere, even as young as 10 or 12, when I knew there was going to be a speaking engagement, because I just couldn't believe that there was an Indian judge out there, that you always think of the legal system as something that's against us. So knowing that there was a First Nations person who was a judge absolutely blew my mind. Even with a native cop for a father, it just blew my mind that there was a judge out there. And I remember he said one time at a justice conference, he said, Creator didn't just give us enough teachings for the white man to come and save us. He said there are teachings for cell phones and computers and mutual funds and everything like that. The problem is somewhere along the way we stopped listening. We stopped with our traditional ceremonies and trying to listen and learn from the energies around us, and stopped applying ourselves, saying, okay, well, because of residential schools and other colonial factors, we've kind of been socially conditioned to believe that our way was the wrong way and it's not adaptable to the modern world. But I know from my relatives and from my ancestors that we are amongst the most adaptable and resourceful people on the planet. We lived in some of the most harshest environment in the world has to offer. Our winters, up north where I'm from, -50 is kind of a regular occurrence in the winter. And to think that our ancestors survived there for tens of thousands of years, without heaters, without, our modern conveniences, is really just truly amazing that they were able to do that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. I really look forward to, we're going to pick a date. I'm going to send you a message and we'll pick another date to continue this conversation, because I know for myself that I'm doing a lot of learning and I'm very inspired by hearing you speak, hearing about your story. And I really just want to share that I'm really inspired by your power and by your knowledge. And I think that knowledge is very powerful, and the confidence that you have just in the knowledge that you naturally have, really, it just radiates from you. So thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Thank you. We'll talk to you very soon.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, Frank.
Are we still on? I don't know. Yeah. We're still on the air. Yeah.
Still on the air. Yeah. I'm trying to to close out here, but that's okay. So in the meantime, I'm trying to click it out. I don't know what's going on here.
There you go.
There we go. Sorry for that. I'm so inspired by that message. So Frank Busch, he's currently with the First Nations Finance Authority. I'll share the links with this message. But before we close and before I let you go, I wanted to just acknowledge this very important time in Canada to do this sharing, to do this learning and sharing knowledge, sharing lateral kindness. I've learned so much from that conversation. I hope that you'll join us next time as well. And I also wanted to share before I left that I have a newsletter that you can sign up at jessicadumas.com. You should get that pop up. And then you can also look for Insights Inc. on my website at jessicadumas.com. But I also have a Facebook page, Insights Inc. with Jessica Dumas, where I'm sharing all kinds of knowledge and information and activities on the Indigenous community. And please, if you like this video, please share it. Please like it. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And join my network of reconciliation and an opportunity to share knowledge, share stories, and really just connect and do so much learning. And also, if you would like to become a sponsor to my newsletter or to this web show, there are opportunities available. So please get in touch with me, and I'd love to have you join me, help more people hear these amazing messages. And I love to hear from you. So continue to send me messages, continue to send questions, keep your eyes and ears open for the next time that I'm going to be chatting with Frank, because I can't wait. I'm so very excited. So I'm going to end this call now. Thank you so much. Have a great day and talk to you very soon.